Chapter 6. Drannith awoke and wished she hadn't. Her whole body hurt, head pounding, arms and legs bruised. When she breathed, she felt a sharp pain in her chest that hinted at a broken rib. She was lying on the grassy earth, and for a moment she wondered if she'd fallen from Vermilion's rail and somehow survived. Not possible. The skyship had been high enough up that going over the side would have reduced her body to paste. So where am I? The sky was fading from blue to black, so several hours had passed. Drannith shifted, wincing at a spike of pain from her rib, and propped herself up on her elbows. All at once, her breath froze in her throat. The monster was right there, not 10 feet away. It was the same winged cat that had nearly killed Lukka, brown and white striped, with bat wings folded against its flanks. They were in the grasslands beside a small, fast-flowing stream, and the cat was kneeling beside the water to drink. Drannith watched in horrified fascination as it bent, huge tongue flicking out, for all the world like a house cat grown to the size of a horse and cart. It knocked me off Vermilion, didn't it? She'd only gotten a glimpse in the spyglass, but she was sure what she'd seen had been the cat's brown and white fur. Was it trying to kill me? But if it wanted to kill her, surely it would have simply done it by now. Her battered memory gave a prickle. That's right. Vermilion was going to crash. That snake was pulling it down. Falk and the crew. Did this thing save me? It seemed absurd. Monsters didn't rescue humans. At best, they were indifferent. At worst, actively hostile. But she couldn't think of another way she could have gotten safely from the deck of the airship to the ground. And since the ozolith was no longer in sight, the cat must have carried her quite a ways. And it brought me here. Why here? The monster finished drinking and turned to her with big, feline eyes. It blinked slowly, then looked down at the stream, back to her, then back to the stream. The meaning of the gesture could hardly be clearer. It wanted me to drink, and she found that she did need water. She hadn't been carrying a canteen, and it had been hours. Her lips were cracked and dry. But the monster gestured again. Drannith pulled herself up to her knees, groaning. All right, I'll drink. Just give me a minute. She shuffled to the edge of the stream and dipped her shaking hands into the water. It was clear and cold and tasted finer than wine. Drannith sucked it down from her cupped palms, always keeping one eye on the looming presence of the cat. Let's think about this logically. Monsters didn't help humans, but this one was connected to Lukka. He communicated with it. Father said that other humans had bonded with monsters, allied with them. It couldn't be coincidence. When she'd drunk her fill, she sat back on her heels and met the thing's enormous yellow-eyed gaze. Did Lukka send you to help me? She asked it. Is that what's happening here? The thing gave no sign of understanding her words. Of course it didn't. But it didn't attack her either, or simply fly off. Instead, it glanced at the creek again, then back at her. Thank you, Drannith said, feeling absurd. I've had all the water I need. She shuffled away from the creek, and that seemed to spur the monster to action. Her heart double thumped as it came forward, but it merely bent down, ears flat, offering one huge forepaw. It's like it wants me to climb up. Can that be right? Lukka did send you, she whispered. She'd seen him just as Vermilion was crashing. Whatever he's doing, he wanted to help me, so he sent you to keep me safe. A low, sonorous rumble filled the air. The winged cat, Jarina realized, was purring. She had no proof that her half-assed deduction was correct. For all she knew, the thing was just playing a particularly cruel game before it killed and ate her. But there's nothing to lose. To put it bluntly, she was dead, alone and injured, with no idea where she was and no supplies in the remotest part of the plains. The chances of finding another human before running into a less polite monster were close to zero, and she certainly couldn't walk back to Drannith. Still, it took considerable willpower before she was able to step forward. Everything she'd ever been taught told her that to be this close to a monster without a weapon in hand was death, but the winged cat held perfectly still. Even when Jarina stepped onto the back of its paw and took hold of its fur. With a grunt of pain, she hoisted herself onto its shoulder, then crawled to the small of its back, lying as flat as she could. Only when she'd stopped moving did the winged cat rise. Jarina guessed what was about to happen, but she was still unprepared for the power of the thing's leap, hurling itself skyward with absurd strength. Its wings snapped open, catching the air, and it glided for a few moments before starting slow, powerful flaps that it took it higher and higher into the air. Jarina held on for dear life, gripping the cat's fur tightly. But in truth, after the initial ascent, her position felt secure, even comfortable. She gathered enough courage to raise her head and saw the plains spread out around her like a map, just as they had been from the deck of Vermilion. Somehow here, though, the sensation of flight was more visceral. She could feel the winged cat's muscles working to keep them in the air. Wind blasted her face, and she put her head down again, burying herself in the monster's long fur. Jarina even managed to get some sleep, though she kept waking up with a start, convinced she was about to slip off the cat's back and fall screaming to the ground below. It never happened, though, and they flew on through the night, stopping only once at another stream for her to drink and relieve herself. By the time the sun rose in the east, it painted a landscape Jarina recognized. The sheepfolds and forests of the fourth ring of Drannith slid underneath, with logging roads leading back into the third ring. Ahead in the distance, she could see the city's spires rising, with the green spike of the Argalith rising highest of all over the citadel. If we try to get that far, though, we'll never make it. Drannith's wall was equipped with dozens of ballistae and protected by the magic of the arcane core, specifically to prevent flying monsters from making it anywhere near the city. If the cat doesn't understand that, we're both going to get skewered. She wasn't entirely certain how to get its attention. In the end, she crawled forward onto its shoulder and grabbed one of its ears, which earned her a subdued yowl of protest. When it looked back her way, she pointed toward the ground with both hands. "Down," she said, as though speaking to a small child. "Come down. We have to land." They were already over the third ring and its forts. Beyond that was the secondary wall. Not as formidable as the main defenses, but still equipped with ballistae and crossbow troops. "Come on, please. I don't want anybody to get shot here. Down." She doubted it understood her words. but something about the frantic gestures seemed to get across. The cat started losing altitude, but slowly. Too slowly. She could see the secondary wall, and the soldiers there had already seen her. Tiny figures scrambled. Oh hells! They were going to open fire. Of course they were. Firing on monsters is what the defenses were for. Down! She screamed at the cat. Let me off! Now! A ballista fired with a distant crack. The cat veered sideways, and the missile hurtled past well wide. The monster went into a dive, gaining speed, and suddenly the ground and the wall were approaching at shocking speed. Another ballista cracked, but far too late. Drina was more worried about the troops who lined the wall with weapons cocked, waiting for the cat to come into range. The smaller bolts wouldn't do much damage to the monster, but they would certainly be deadly to her. Hey! She screamed as loudly as she could. Whatever was broken in her chest gave her a spike of pain. She gritted her teeth and waved her arms. Hold fire! Hold your bloody fire! The cat was going for a landing on the wall. Gods above! It flared its wings, killing most of its speed and making itself a perfect target. 24 crossbows thrummed. Drina pressed herself low, knowing it wouldn't be enough, and then found herself sliding across the cat's fur as it twisted in mid-air, putting the bulk of its body between her and the shooters. She heard the thunk of bolts hitting flesh, and the cat flapped its wings desperately to stabilize itself. Too late. She'd overbalanced, and her grip on its fur wasn't strong enough to keep her from sliding off its back entirely. For a moment she dangled against its flank, then 2 hanks of fur came away in her hands, and she was falling. It wasn't a long fall, in the scheme of things, but she took it badly, coming down hard on her back against the unforgiving stone of the wall. Something shifted in her chest, and she felt like someone had slipped a knife into her, leaving it where it cut with every breath. She coughed, and a mist of blood sprayed from her lips. Behind her, the winged cat made an ungainly landing, thrown off by the mid-air maneuver that had saved her life. Its side and belly were stuck full of crossbow bolts. Don't fire! Drina rolled over, pulled her knees under her, tried to rise. Don't kill it! Don't! I am Captain Drina, daughter of General Kudro. She coughed again. Capture this monster. Don't kill. Captain, someone said. The voice was distant. Drina tried to get to her feet, but something gave way inside her, and blood gouted from her mouth, splashing on the stone. Her strength vanished, and she slumped forward. The last thing she heard as darkness took her was the sound of booted footsteps. Captain, the voice was calm. Can you hear me? Drina opened her eyes again. She was in the Citadel infirmary, not the same room where Lukka had been, where all this had started, but another just like it, with a single bed for an important patient. A doctor whose robe bore the insignia of the arcane corps stood beside her, watching her eyes. Drina, he repeated. Just nod. She nodded, blearily. Her pain had gone, replaced with a numbness that somehow felt even worse. The doctor smiled. You're going to be all right, he said. You had quite an adventure, apparently. Broken ribs, punctured lung. A few other bits and pieces out of place. But we'll sort it all out. Don't worry. Monster. The best Drina could manage was a whisper. The monster. What happened? Don't worry about that, the doctor said. I'm going to give you something to help you sleep. You'll feel better, I promise. No, Drina muttered. Father, please, need to speak. He wasn't listening. She felt a cold touch at the back of her neck, and the world faded away again. The next time she woke up, her mind was clearer and the pain was back. Not as bad as it had been, not the knife-like stab of something badly wrong, but a dull, throbbing ache all through her chest. She blinked, groaned, and tried to raise her head. "General? She's awake." It was a different doctor, but Drina barely got a glimpse of him as he scurried away. He was replaced by the familiar features of her father, shaven-headed and mustached, in the formal uniform he invariably wore. "Drina," he said. "Can you speak?" I can," Drina said, and swallowed. "Good. They informed me that you would be mostly covered by this morning." He looked over his shoulders. "Leave us, please. The captain and I have matters to discuss." "Of course, sir." The doctor closed the door as he left, and there was a moment of silence. The general looked uncomfortable, as though struggling with unfamiliar emotions. "I am pleased that you have returned," he said, eventually. "It had been long enough that there was some concern over the success of your mission." "Thank you, sir," Drina said. "But I have to report, I did not succeed. Captain Lukka is still at large." "Perhaps you had better give your report from the beginning," Kudro said. Drina swallowed hard but obeyed, going through her first confrontation with Lukka and his strange ally, the side trip to Skysail, and the eventual battle at the ozolith that had claimed the lives of the hunters. The general listened, unmoved, as she described the destruction of the Vermilion. His expression flickered only when she came to her own escape, how the winged cat had taken her from the dying ship and brought her back to Drannith. "That monster," he said, "is it the same one that Captain Lukka communicated with? You're certain?" "I'm certain," Drina said. "What happened after we landed on the wall? Did it escape?" "The officer in command heard your request to keep it alive," Kudro said. "He was able to capture it, since it didn't seem inclined to resist." "It's alive." Somehow, that was a relief. Drina wasn't sure she was thinking rationally, but at the very least, the monster represented some kind of connection to Lukka. "And it saved my life." As though reading her thoughts, Kudro said, "Do you know why the monster assisted you?" "I can only speculate, sir," Drina said. "Speculate, then." "At the ozolith, Lukka saw me aboard Vermilion as it was falling. I believe he may have instructed the monster to rescue me and take me home. Whatever has happened to him, he still cares for me." Kudro said. "And his command over the creature is strong enough to do this?" "Evidently, sir. I can think of no other explanation." "That, in itself, is troubling," Kudro sighed. "Rumors are spreading, Captain. My own daughter arrived at the city walls on the back of a monster. A dozen common soldiers saw it, so we could hardly hope to keep things quiet. It has produced some unrest." "I'm sorry, sir." "It's not your fault, Captain." Kudro straightened up. "Rest now. I promise you, I will take care of everything." It was another day before the doctors pronounced her fit to leave her bed. Drina spent it fretting impatiently, while simultaneously feeling vaguely guilty. Any common soldier, with her injuries, wouldn't have had access to magical healing, and might have laid up for months if they recovered at all. Still, she gave a sigh of relief when the pokes and prods ended and an odd rancor brought her a fresh uniform and boots. Dressed and feeling properly clean for the first time in weeks, she emerged from the infirmary to find a courier waiting. "Captain Drina," the woman saluted. "The General wishes to know if you are prepared to make a public appearance." "I need to eat something first," Drina said. Her stomach rumbled at the thought of real food. "After that, certainly." "Very good, sir. He instructs you to meet him on the Citadel steps in 2 hours. That was Kudro all over, Drina reflected. Polite enough to ask, and certain enough of your response to have his answer already planned. She ducked into one of the Citadel's cafeterias and wolfed down a bowl of beef and rice. Simple soldier's food that felt like an unspeakable luxury after so long living on trail rations. After a quick trip back to her quarters to work over her hair, she hurried down to the main floor, where the sounds of a crowd filtered in even through the massive fortress doors. The Citadel's main doors, massive iron and oak things that were opened only on ceremonial occasions, led onto an equally massive set of marble steps, spreading wider as they descended until they reached the market square in front of the fortress. It was the usual place for the general or other high-ranking officers to address the people of Drannith, and Drina had stood beside her father many times while he'd made some proclamations or other. She wasn't sure why he needed her now, but she knew better than to argue. Colonel Bride was waiting in the marble-floored lobby, uniform immaculate, his expression as pompous as ever. He gave her a condescending nod. "Captain?" Drina saluted. "Colonel, I'm supposed to be meeting my father." "He's outside, overseeing preparations." The colonel looked her over appraisingly. "It was good to hear you've returned in one piece." "Thank you, Colonel," Drina said, keeping a sarcastic spin off the words with an effort. No doubt it would please Bride to no end if both the general's daughter and his rising star disappeared into the wilds and never came back. "It sounds as though they're ready for us," the colonel said. "Come with me." They went out through a small postern door beside the main gate, and Drina found herself blinking in the midday sun. The crowd noise redoubled, and swelled murmur broken by individual shouts and whistles. Below, on the steps, 2 companies of the elite Citadel Guard stood at attention, and beyond them was a mob of Drannith commoners, eager as always for the promise of a show. What grabbed Drina's attention was a wooden platform at the top of the steps, where the general would usually stand to speak. Splayed out on the boards, held down by weighted chains as thick as Drina's neck, was the winged cat. "They brought it here?" Drina hissed at Colonel Bride. "A monster on the steps of the Citadel?" "A monster that has been very tightly bound," the colonel said. "The general insisted. Come." He descended, and Drina followed. At the sight of her, the murmur of the crowd rose higher. More Citadel guards were arrayed around the monster, long spears lowered and ready to skewer it. General Kudro himself stood on the wooden platform near the winged cat's head, hands tucked behind his back, watching the crowd. Beside him, resting on a table, a long-handled great sword gleamed in the sun. "Oh no," Drina's stomach nodded. "No, they can't mean to." "Of course they can," something in her head replied. "It's a monster. This is what you do with monsters." "Sir," Drina said quietly, as she and Bride came to stand beside the general. "Sir, this is not a good idea." Kudro smiled, but there was no humor in it. He kept his voice low, nearly inaudible under the roar of the crowd. "Not a good idea, Captain. Killing monsters is always a good idea." "This monster may be our only connection to Captain Lukka. If we're going to find him..." "A monster he controls utterly? Under what circumstances could we use that to find him without taking on a terrible risk?" "I'd take on that risk, sir." She looked at the winged cat, which stared back at her with huge yellow eyes. "It saved my life once already." "Only a fool, having thrown the dice and seen them come up sixes, bets everything on it happening a second time," Kudro said. "No, the creature must die. And you, Captain, must kill it." "Me?" Drannith found herself taking a step back from the waiting great sword. "Why?" "Because," Kudro said, smiling for the crowd, "the rumors that have begun to spread say that you and Captain Lukka are both traitors to humanity, that you both have turned to the wilds, allying yourselves with the monstrous, and that the manner of your return here is the proof that, if I do not deal with you, you will betray Drannith and doom us all." "That's absurd," Drannith said. "I agree," the general said. "But if the people believe it, then my hands are tied." He lowered his voice even further, so Drannith had to lean in to hear. "You know as well as I do, daughter, that I will not be able to bear my responsibilities forever. I had hoped Captain Lukka might grow into someone worth to be my successor. Now, that is impossible. But you," he took a breath, "you were always my second choice for the job. Not to demean your ability, you understand, but Drannith is not a kingdom, and I am not a king. And it is not entirely seemly that my position would pass on within my family. Despite that, there is no one I can trust more, and in the absence of Captain Lukka, you are the only logical choice. Unless, of course, the people have lost all trust in you. Do you understand?" Drannith wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. For years, she's wondered if her father would ever acknowledge her abilities, if he was even capable of seeing his daughter as a competent officer. For him to say this now, and so bluntly, was very much like the general, I suppose. But she took a deep breath. "I still don't think we need to kill this monster. Not now, at any rate. It might be a bargaining chip, or..." "We have no choice," Kudro hissed. "You have no choice. They've all seen you now. Do you know what they will say if you turn away?" "You could have warned me," Drannith shot back. "I could have." And suddenly she realized the truth. This is a test. The rumors might be absurd, but Kudro himself wasn't immune to the speculation. What if his daughter, his precious would-be heir, had been infected by whatever sympathy for monsters had already taken Lukka? He'd arranged this show for her to prove her loyalty, not just to the crowd, but to him. Drannith put her hand on the hilt of the great sword. It was a long, heavy weapon with a weighted tip, perfect for cleaving flesh and bone with a single downward stroke. The winged cat's neck was stretched out by the chains that bound it. One swing, if she was good enough, and it would all be over. The cat blinked slowly. She wondered how much it understood about what was happening. She saw it on the plain, leading her to the stream to drink, twisting to put its own body between her and the guards' crossbows. I can't, Drina said. She spoke with a sense of wonder surprising even herself. What? Kudro hissed. This monster saved my life, Drina shook her head. We kill the monsters because they try to kill us. That's how it always has been. But this one hasn't hurt me. Since it bonded with Lukka, it hasn't hurt anyone. I can't just kill it now for bringing me home. Daughter, Kudro's voice was deadly calm. Think about what you're saying. Believe me, I have, Drina said. I won't do it, father. The crowd's shouts rose. For a long moment, Kudro did nothing. Then finally he said, Colonel Bride. Yes, sir. Bride stepped forward, and Drina could hear the smirk in his voice. My daughter is tired. Please return her to her quarters. Of course, sir. Father, Drina said as the colonel took her arm. Please, you don't have to. Someone does, Kudro muttered as he lifted the great sword. Drina. Lukka slept beside a boulder, in the shade of a stunted tree, surrounded by the hulking black shapes of his nightmares. What happened to you? At his direction, the nightmares had searched for days, first through the wreck of the skyship, and then all around the Ozolith. There were plenty of bodies damaged to varying degrees, but none of them were wearing a Coppercoat uniform. And I saw her wearing that, for certain. It had been a brief glimpse as the ship was falling, but he was sure. So what happened to her? His army had grown, was still growing. Whenever a monster wandered close enough to the Ozolith, Lukka exerted his will and power flowed through the giant crystal and bound it to him. He had servants from every clade now, not just nightmares, but cats and beasts, dinosaurs and elementals, a huge cloud drake, and a flock of tiny vicious spear mice. He put them to work in the search, sending them the image of Drina. If she got away, she can't have gone far. With no ship, no monster to ride, she was stuck walking. But that still meant a huge region to search all around the Ozolith, thick with wandering monsters not yet under Lukka's control. If she met with one of them, she could be in some dinosaur's stomach by now. He tried to harden himself to the possibility that his searchers might turn up her corpse, but the thought of that, of never knowing for certain, was too much to bear. The monsters brought him water and meat from their kills, and he scavenged rations from the dead sailors and hunters. The Ozolith had expanded his perceptions, his mind flitting from monster to monster, so much that his body didn't seem to matter anymore. But he still had to sleep, curled awkwardly in his ragged greatcoat against the boulder. Now, he woke with a gasp as a vision unfolded behind his eyes. He saw the citadel of Drannith, a towering mountain of stone built around the vast green shape of the Argolith. He was on the front steps where he'd walked many times, returning from a successful mission or off to his next adventure. They were crowded with people, as they often were, held back by the citadel guard. He felt tight, painful chains on his body, running sores on his stomach where he'd been wounded and never allowed to heal. No. The sensation was familiar. The winged cat. He hadn't found her either after the battle. He'd assumed that whatever power the Ozolith had gifted him had somehow interfered with their bond, and the creature had simply left on her own accord. But the link between them still functioned, and she was in Drannith, far to the south, bound on the citadel steps with heavy iron chains. She managed to turn her head just a little. Drina! She stood beside her father, engaged in a furious whispered argument. She's alive. Alive, clean, apparently unhurt. She looked furious. General Kudro's expression was a mask, but Lukka knew the old man well enough to guess that he was angry too. Emotion pulsed at him from the winged cat, a feeling directed toward Drannith. Protection, satisfaction, the image of a long flight away from danger. You saved her. He remembered watching the skyship falling, watching Drannith falling and reaching out. But I never asked you to. The colonel, standing beside Drannith, took her arm and dragged her away up the steps. Kudro stepped forward and picked up a long, gleaming great sword. What is he doing? But of course, Lukka knew. Satisfaction, the cat sent him, and then sadness. The blade came down, and the link vanished. Lukka lay against the boulder for a long time, motionless. Eventually he forced himself to rise, eyes wet with tears, jaw tight with fury. Drannith is in Drannith. In Drannith. And the cat had taken her there, knowing how much he cared for her. He closed his eyes, and his will lashed out, power spreading further and faster than it ever had before. Across the plain, monsters froze, crackling with orange light. Then as one, they turned to face south. As one, they began to move, coming together like 100 streams merging to form a mighty river. The largest creature in Lukka's immediate entourage, a 6-legged dinosaur with a long, curving neck, came up beside him with footsteps that shook the earth. It bent its head down, meekly, and Lukka pulled himself astride it, heedless of where its tough scales tore his uniform. He rubbed his eyes as it straightened up, lifting him high into the air. Drannith was in Drannith. And I'm going home.